Hey, what's up YouTube? This is tcgsam here, and in today's video I'm going to be going over what I think are going to be the best decks in the upcoming Duelist Advance format. I'll be showcasing a bunch of deck lists so you guys can have a better idea of what each of these decks may look like. I'll also be talking about their strengths and weaknesses and how they match up in the general metagame overall. Do keep in mind that at the time of recording, Duelist Advance hasn't even come out yet, so we don't really have any results for some of the decks that are only going to be viable after Duelist Advance, so do keep that in mind when taking a look at this list. While most of it is based on like actual results we've seen this past month, some of it is still going to be my personal opinion and perspective only, so do keep that in mind and take what I say with a grain of salt. But with all that being said, let's hop straight into it. Starting off with some honorable mentions, the first deck I want to talk about is White Forest Azamina. This deck did fall off a little bit harder than I guess most people would have expected, but I think it kind of makes sense given how many hand traps people are playing in their main deck nowadays. Cards like Perulia and Droll are very good against the White Forest deck, and most decks are choosing to main these now. So I think that this deck has struggled a lot more because of that. It's still a very scary combo deck, don't get me wrong, and I do think it could still be a top 10 worthy deck, but I think that with the trend of hand traps that people are playing right now, it just isn't really the right format for White Forest. One of the new decks that we got this past month was Orcust, and I think that Orcust is something with a lot of potential. Yes, it is a deck that loses to Lancia in theory, just like Maliss, and since everyone's going to be on Lancia for Maliss anyways, like this deck sort of gets caught in the crossfire, which is one big downside of it. But I do feel like that Orcust does have some ways around this by playing the Fiendsmith engine, by supplementing their own engine with like the Millennium cards to give them more bodies to get into that Fiendsmith engine. I just feel like this deck is one of those decks that just sets up a really crazy end board, has very good grind game, and even when it faces a card like Lancia, they do have ways around it with their normal engine. So I don't think that a card like Lancia is going to be like an auto win against this deck, but that being said though, it is still hit quite hard by like the hand traps that everyone's are playing in their deck already, so cards like the Bystials, cards like Lancia like I mentioned. So I don't think this deck will do any better than like maybe the lower end of top 10, but I do think this is something with a ton of potential. Not to mention the Orcust engine is also fairly flexible. You can play it with the Mitsurugi engine, which is probably the best engine in the game right now. Alright, so getting into number 10, we have Vanquish Soul. I think that Vanquish Soul is a deck with a lot of potential this current format, just because of its playstyle being pretty different from the decks that we have in the top 10 right now. A lot of the hand traps that are commonly being played right now, outside of like maybe Droll and Perulia, are just not very good against Vanquish Soul. This deck, like I mentioned, has a very different playstyle, so it's not really going to play that hard into Charmies like Meowls or Fulos. It has ways to dodge targeting interruptions like Imprim through just with its own engine. And not to mention, this deck also has a pretty crazy built-in hand trap in Holy Sue. So I think that the biggest thing this deck has going for it is that one, people probably aren't going to be as prepared for this deck as some of the other decks we have in the top 10 right now. Plus its resilience to common hand traps also makes it so this deck should be able to get going a lot of times if it doesn't break. I don't think it'll be any higher than top 10 because I do think that this deck is still somewhat clunky in the sense that when you're building this deck, you kind of have to take into consideration what specific hand traps you actually can play, because this deck does rely on you having very specific attributes in hand. So cards like Fulos, cards like Imprim that don't really match up into those attributes just makes it so your Vanquish Soul engine is less likely to be live. And I think that sort of restriction on deck building means like this, you can't really be too flexible with the way you build this deck, and this deck will ultimately be held back by the fact that pool of non-engine that it gets to choose from is a lot more limited than the other decks in the top 10. All that being said though, I do think this is a meta contending deck, and this is definitely a deck I think you should watch out for in the upcoming month. Moving on to number 9, it's going to be Evil Twin Fiendsmith. This is the list that got first place as YC as Keto, and personally I actually don't like this deck that much. Yes, it's a very strong deck that bridges very well into the Fiendsmith engine, but I just feel like its very big weakness to a common hand trap like Fua just makes it so I feel like it can be a little awkward to play at a long tournament. Everyone's going to have Fua in their main decks pretty much, and having to sort of just hope your opponent doesn't have it doesn't really seem like a great way to go about things. I guess outside of that though, it is a fairly scary deck. Like the Light Twin engine does a lot. It gives them a bunch of bodies on the board, gives them a bunch of interruption on your turn, a couple of draws, bridges really nicely into the Fiendsmith engine like I mentioned. So I do think that outside of its weakness to Fua, this is a deck that is pretty good too, especially because it plays around a card like Droll very well. So there is quite a few things going for Evil Twin Fiendsmith. I don't think it goes any higher though, because like I mentioned, its weakness to Fua, and it sort of seems like its own engine is going to be one of the worst in the top 10 at actually like playing into a board. Like a little live tuna monsters actually don't really do that much when going second. So I think that unless you see like a bunch of hand traps and are able to stop your opponent from putting up any semblance of a board, it's going to be a struggle going second even into certain half boards. But despite that, it did win Y6 Keto, so I do want to give some credibility to this deck. I do think it is still a top 10 deck, but I don't think it will be any higher than like the bottom half of top 10. Coming in at number 8 is going to be another new deck, and that's going to be Lunalight. So I think that Lunalight is going to be a very powerful deck this upcoming format because of Liger Dancer specifically. Liger Dancer, for those of you who don't know, is essentially a towers monster that can destroy all special summon monsters your opponent controls once per turn, and that sort of monster is just very difficult for a lot of decks to have a clean out to. Most decks will have maybe like one out, so like think about a deck like Ryzeal, they can go like Detonator, have its attack be doubled with a card like Dugars or something like that. But if this deck's able to summon double towers, like I think the only deck that even has a chance of outing both of them is a deck like Maliss, but even then it's still very unlikely that the Maliss player will actually get to that spot. So all that is to say is Lunalight Liger Dancer can sort of just win games on its own, meaning even if your opponent hits you with cards like Charmies, it's not going to be that impactful because the Lunalight player can just simply choose to give your opponent like 5 or 6 straws while ending on Liger Dancer and still make it so the opponent doesn't really have a realistic way to out the Liger Dancer, and they'll just end up losing on the next turn. So that's kind of like I think the biggest strength of Lunalight. It does suffer a lot from getting hit with Droll and Lockbird though, and of course Droll is in everyone's main decks right now, so I do think that that's sort of a big thing that's holding Lunalight back. Not to mention this deck also is definitely more incentivized to play like the fusion monsters now, and like with other fusion decks, a big choke point of this deck becomes like, oh, if I'm able to cut off like the fusion spells, the deck just isn't really able to do anything that's like super meaningful. But I do think that this is a very scary deck that you're probably going to want to think about in your deck building, making sure you have an out to Liger Dancer, because if even a single one comes down and you don't have a good way to out it, the game could just be over on the spot even if you've drawn a bunch of cards off of your Charmies. Coming in at number 7 is going to be Mitsurugi Fiendsmith next. This list did get top 4 at the Switzerland Nationals, and I think it's no surprise to most people that Mitsurugi is kind of taking over the game. It is the best engine that we have in Yu-Gi-Oh right now. It's very resilient against like the common hand traps like the Mulcharmies, and even some hands have the ability to play around or through Droll as well. So I think that even though people are respecting this deck and building their decks to beat it, the Mitsurugi engine just does so much to where if you don't see Droll specifically, it kind of feels like they can just blow past like any amount of like normal hand traps that you may throw at it. This version of the deck also gets the Fiendsmith engine in there to raise its ceiling, so its end boards become a lot more than just a copy of Murakumo with like a way to summon it back on the opponent's turn. You also have to deal with cards like Caesar and then Lacrima in the graveyard, plus infinite follow-up from like the Mitsurugi cards and from the Fiendsmith card. So it kind of means like if you aren't able to kill this deck, you're pretty much dead to their follow-up on the next turn guaranteed, which makes it a very scary prospect to go against this. Now, I will say that this deck, I will say though, by adding the Fiendsmith cards, you are sort of opening yourself up to being hit with the Abyss Seals and DD Crow a little bit harder, and you're starting to open yourself up to hand traps like Fualos as well, which normally wouldn't be very good against the Mitsurugi engine. So even though the Fiendsmith engine can be very good at helping you play through cards like Droll Lockbird and raising your ceiling, I think that introducing them also introduces a few new weaknesses to the deck as well. And not to mention, you also add a few more like sort of clunky cards that you don't necessarily want to see into your deck. Cards like Lacrima, cards like Paradise, you don't really necessarily want to see them most of the time. So I think that this deck, while it does have a higher ceiling than Mitsurugi, like you can argue it has a slightly less consistency than like the pure version of the deck. Speaking of the pure version, coming in at number 6, I think pure Mitsurugi is going to be one of the top contenders in this upcoming format. It wasn't that popular the last time I did this list, but in the past month, we've seen a lot more people start to experiment with like the pure Mitsurugi deck. It's also had a couple of other very good placements in a lot of the other European national events as well. So I think this is definitely a deck that should be on everyone's radar now. I think a lot of the successful Mitsurugi lists are either playing like the pure version or just playing a very compact and very small Ryzeal engine, making it so the Mitsurugi cards themselves are a focus of the deck because it allows them to play power cards like Pre-Preparation or Rites. It allows them to play a triple Mitsurugi Ritual, which just means the deck should be able to play through a lot of the common hand traps a little bit more often now. Like I talked about with the Mitsurugi Fiendsmith build, like the Mitsurugi engine just doesn't lose to hand traps like Fua and Purulia, and even though yes, Droll is a very good card against it, it sort of feels like Droll is like the only silver bullet against like the pure Mitsurugi deck, whereas at least with the Ryzeal version, like a card like Purulia and Fua are still fairly good against them because the Ryzeal side of the deck does play a lot into them. But I think the pure Mitsurugi version sort of takes away those weaknesses from the Ryzeal Mitsurugi deck. That being said, though, of course, it is going to have a lot lower of a ceiling than a deck like Ryzeal Mitsurugi, and going second, it can make it so it's a little bit harder, because there is that choke point of having to access your ritual spell to start your plays, and then being able to actually resolve that ritual spell and summon out like a Murakumo to blow up the board. If your opponent's able to stop the Mitsurugi player from getting there, it becomes very difficult for the pure Mitsurugi deck to really crack boards, at least compared to like the Ryzeal deck, which has access to like X, for example. Something nice about this version as well, you get to play the Wosu Kaiju, which means like you do have a searchable out to the Liger Dancer, which I think is going to be pretty important in this upcoming format. I think decks do need to respect the fact that there is a very powerful Towers-esque monster in the format now, and you definitely need something to out it. But all that being said though, I think Pure Mitsurugi is going to be a very solid deck that sort of just falls in like the middle of the pack for the top 10. It's sort of held back by the fact that its ceiling isn't super high, but it's one of its biggest strengths is that it doesn't really lose to hand traps that well, and its own engine is very good at generating bodies and extra advantage and follow-up. Cracking into the top 5, we have Mermail Atlantean. So even though Mermail Atlantean hasn't actually won any events, at least from as far as I can tell, it seems like there's always one or two that goes super deep into a tournament. And I do think that this is also a deck that should be on people's radars. Like I said before in my other top 10 videos, I think Mermail probably has the best engine in the game right now at going second and just being able to crack boards with its engine alone. Considering cards like Heavy Infantry, considering cards like the Storming Atlantean, you're just able to generate advantage while simultaneously cracking through your opponent's board. Not to mention, of course, this deck is obviously very good at going first. It's still able to set up the hand loop with Moon Glacia. It's going for like the water barrier statue now and protecting it with the Neptibus Link 3, meaning cards like Imperm aren't going to be clean out to the barrier statue like it might have been before. So I do think that this is a very scary deck, both going first and going second. I do think, however, that sometimes this deck will suffer a little bit from consistency. This deck loses a lot of power if it isn't able to get Neptibus into rotation. It sort of feels like the quality of the other cards in this deck don't really stand up to Neptibus, meaning if your opponent's able to cut off Neptibus access, it almost sort of feels like you're negging every time you're trying to resolve some of your effects. You generally aren't able to generate that much advantage without getting access to Neptibus. So I do think that is one big choke point of the deck, and not to mention there are quite a few like awkward engine requirements that you also don't want to see. It is also a deck that does get hit by drill, so that's something to keep in mind, although it does have ways around the card like some of the other top decks. I don't think it'll go any higher than like around this place in the top 10. Coming in at number 4 is going to be Memento. This list did win the Indahalian Nationals, and I think this list is very interesting because it sort of shows the path that Memento players might start to take in this upcoming format, being my engine is good enough to go second and break boards with, so I'm just going to play like only Charmies and a board breaker like Super Poly, making it so like if I'm able to put you on a half board, or if I'm able to take away part of your board as Super Poly, my normal engine should just be able to play through it. And I do think that's something that's very scary with the Memento deck. It sort of feels like even if you have an established board, they just have so much gas and so many ways to get around like common end board pieces like Detonator with like the quick play spells and all that. And I think that sort of gives them like a similar strength as Mermail in the sense that like it's a deck that's obviously very good at going first, but has the ability to go second with just engine as well in some cases. Memento is also a deck that is fairly resilient to all the Charmies. Like most of the time, the Memento deck shouldn't give more than like 1, maybe 2 draws off of any of the Charmies to their opponents. So that just makes it so these commonly played hand traps that are in everyone's deck just don't really affect Memento that much. Even a card like Droll, while I personally do think it's very good, a lot of Memento players say like it doesn't really do that much against the deck, which I think is honestly terrifying. Like if cards like Charmies and Droll aren't that good against this deck, like what is left to stop it? I do think that the biggest thing holding this deck back from being any better is the fact that it has a very high like skill floor. Like it's very difficult to play this deck optimally, and this deck is not very forgiving compared to like a deck like Ryzeal or Maliss, like where that are able to sort of just snowball really quickly and generate a ton of advantage off of like a single card. Even a couple misplays here or there with those decks aren't nearly as punishing with something compared to something like Memento, because you have to always constantly think about how to get like your guys into rotation for your boss monster, how to play around like the common hand traps, and how to like sequence your plays properly into those common hand traps as well. And I think that deck difficulty makes it so it's not only hard to pick up, meaning it's going to probably see less representation since less people are playing it, but also at a big tournament when you're playing multiple rounds in a row, it's gonna be very hard to play this at like the highest level unless you're very experienced with the deck. That's honestly like the only bad thing I can say about the Memento deck, other than the fact that it's very difficult to play. This is one of the scariest decks in the game right now, and I think I wouldn't be surprised if it slowly starts seeing more popularity as more and more people decide to try it out and get better with the deck, so they can circumvent the deck's weakness of being like very difficult to play. I suppose the deck also does maybe have some weaknesses sometimes with like clunky hands, but outside of that, like it honestly feels like Memento is one of the stronger combo decks right out there right now, and like I mentioned, I wouldn't be surprised if this deck continues to do well in the future. Next up at number 3, we have Primite Blue-Eyes. This list got top 8 at the French Nationals, and I think that the Blue-Eyes deck is also something that's still going to be very good in this upcoming format. It's definitely still like the 3rd most represented deck in terms of like the top cuts right now. There seems to always be at least like 1 or 2 Blue-Eyes in every single top cut of like all the major events that we were seeing right now, and I think for a good reason. One, the Primite engine is obviously still very, very powerful. Drill Beam is an incredible card. The Primite engine does give them like a ton of grind game that this deck can really benefit from. This is a deck that also doesn't lose super hard to common cards like the Charmies as well. So I do think that this deck is able to play a style of gameplay that makes it pretty resilient to like a lot of the common hand traps as well. Joel's gonna still hurt this deck, but I do think that outside of that, the higher impact hand traps like Charmies that people are playing are just not going to be super great against this right now. It's also still a fairly consistent deck as well as a fair number of starters, and even though their combos aren't nearly as high, like don't nearly do as much as some of the like Maliss or Ryzeal decks, it does still set up quite a formidable end board, so I do think it's still worth respecting this deck. Overall, I do think that while Blue-Eyes is a very good deck, I don't think it'll be able to surpass like number 1 and 2, which should be no surprise to anyone. Speaking of number 2, it's going to be Maliss. This is a list that won French Nationals. There are a few cards that are worth talking about in this list in my opinion. The first one being like the higher count of Bystials. It seems like the European Maliss players really enjoy their higher counts of Bystials. I assume to counter Mitsurugi and to act as like pretty good extenders. But also another interesting trend is that a lot of European lists are playing like double Delta and 1 Gamma. I should be releasing my Where to Hand Trap video in the video directly after this one. And you'll notice that in that list, I also talk about like how powerful a card like Delta and Gamma can be into pretty much every single matchup. So I think that now if you're playing against the Maliss Ignister deck, you do need to consider these cards. It has started to get a lot more popular, and these cards still can be very high impact against the best decks out there. Maybe one extra interesting thing is that this list isn't playing any Charmies at all in the main deck or side deck. I think one reason for that is they probably always want their hand traps to be live when they're going first. So like if your opponent, let's say, like stopped your Dormouse on the normal summon, well, suddenly all your Charmies become dead, and your opponent can just run you over if you don't have enough hand traps to stop them. So while I personally do think that you do still need to play Charmies in the Maliss deck, I thought this list was good to show because it does show a alternate way of approaching this deck. But regardless of how you build the Maliss deck, it is still, I think, the second best deck in the game right now. Still very powerful, good at going first, and is able to play a ton of non-engine for going second. And then coming in at number 1, I think no surprises, it's still going to be Mitsurugi Ryzeal. Even though I think that more people have started to switch to like the pure Mitsurugi deck, I still think that the Ryzeal engine just does so much right now. I do really like this more like condensed Ryzeal engine, so cutting cards like Star, cutting cards like Cross, which sort of just seem like unnecessary bricks. Just makes it so you only are drawing like the good Ryzeal cards in your hand. They'll always get you to like the Mitsurugi side of your deck, plus set up a detonator on top of that, which is obviously very good against most of the decks out there right now as well. Other than that though, I don't think much else changes between like the lists from last month and the lists that we're seeing this month. Maybe you'll see some lists starting to play pre-preparation of Rice as well, just because of how powerful a card that is. And maybe some lists will just end up choosing to play more non-engine because they're able to cut like all the fluff out of their deck. Like I said when I was talking about the Mitsurugi decks, like the Mitsurugi engine is definitely the best engine that we have in Yu-Gi-Oh right now, and then pair it with the other best engine that we have in Yu-Gi-Oh right now being these Ryzeal cards. It's no surprise that this deck is still going to be number 1 in my opinion, and I definitely wouldn't be surprised to see this deck continue to win more and more events, even though people are definitely prepared for it. Alright, so that's going to wrap it up for this video. Let me know what you thought about it in the comment section below. Do you agree or disagree with my rankings? Like, do you think there are going to be any decks that are going to do better than what I think? Do you think there are like some underrated decks that I may have missed? Let me know in the comment section below. And once again, keep in mind that at the time of recording, there haven't been any results for the Duelist Advance format yet, so a lot of this is just going to be my personal opinion and my predictions. So do keep that in mind when leaving your comments. But with all that being said, hope you guys enjoyed the video. Make sure to leave a like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow, and it really helps keep me motivated to keep posting more videos like this. And with all that, I will see you guys in the next one. Take care.